Hey guys, so this will be the last of the material that you need to know before exam 3, and this is probably my least favorite session of the semester just because the information in this chapter is so much summary. There's very few key terms, and so I'm just going to try to condense down everything in the textbook to the main points so that you have like a concise summary and don't have to go reread your textbook to find all of this stuff. But that said, it's just going to be kind of a lot of bullet points of information. So like always, here's the answer to the warm-up. You should have done it before you started watching this video, I hope. Okay, so starting out with experiencing emotion, first we've just got the 6 basic emotions: joy or happiness, anger, disgust, sadness, fear, and surprise. And then in infants, we also can identify a distinct facial expression for interest or curiosity, and so that's kind of debatable for whether or not we consider it a distinct emotion, but definitely those big 6 and then maybe that 7th. Okay, causes and consequences of anger. So the main cause of anger is going to be that we face a threat or a challenge, and if we're fearful of that threat or challenge, then that triggers us to flight, right? And if we're angry, that triggers us to fight. So it's that fight or flight threat that often triggers anger. Anger can harm us. We know that chronic hostility is linked to heart disease. Anger is a very negative emotion, and also when you're angry, it floods your body with stress hormones, and this can cause negative health effects as well. It boosts our heart rate, causes us to sweat, increases testosterone levels. Again, this is just a result of sympathetic nervous system activation. Boys tend to walk or exercise to get rid of anger. Girls try to talk about it, listen to music, or write. So we have different ways of coping. But releasing angry feelings can be better than internalizing them, and that's kind of known as this idea of catharsis, the idea that if we release this aggressive energy by punching a punching bag or something like that, then that'll relieve our aggressive urges and we'll feel better. And what we found scientifically on that is that expressing anger, performing catharsis can be temporarily calming, but it tends not to have a long-lasting effect on our anger level. And then according to the behavior feedback effect, so if we remember that from last session, the behavior feedback effect was talking about how your emotions can change based on what your body is doing. And so if you're sitting up straight, you feel more confident. So with working off of that idea, the behavior feedback effect would suggest that acting angry would actually make us angrier. And so catharsis through the lens of the behavior feedback effect should not be effective. Some better ways to manage your anger: you can wait until you feel better. Time always heals. Find a healthy distraction or support and distance yourself. Notice that there are 3 suggestions given here. I've seen test questions in the past saying which of the following is not a suggestion for dealing with anger. So note what these 3 are, know them. All right. But forgiveness does release anger and calm the body. We found some pretty convincing scientific evidence to suggest that forgiveness, just kind of letting go of your anger, is more effective than catharsis. Okay, moving on to happiness. So our state of happiness influences everything. It influences the way that we treat others, the way that we perceive what's going on in our lives. It just kind of influences the way that we see the world. So happy people are going to perceive the world as safer. They're drawn to emotionally positive information. They're confident and decisive. They cooperate, and they're healthier and more energized. Conversely, when you're gloomy, life as a whole seems depressing and meaningless. You think more skeptically and attend more critically to your surroundings. Happiness helps to predict your future life course. So happy people are more likely to marry and less likely to divorce. Happy people tend to make more money as well. And then happiness doesn't just feel good, it does good. And that has to do with the feel good, do good phenomenon. So this is that when you are in a good mood, when you feel good, then you are more likely to do something good for other people. So when you feel good, you do good. By that same token, when you do something good, it often makes you feel good. So this kind of works on a positive feedback loop where I feel good, so I do something good, and then doing something good makes me feel even better. And so I continue to do good things and I continue to feel good. People feel more positively when they give compared to when they receive. That's kind of interesting. And that's adaptive because it's going to strengthen our social relationships with others. Okay. So when it comes to positive psychology or humanistic psychologists, so humanistic psychologists are the professionals who practice positive psychology. But anytime you see humanistic or positive, those go together. And positive or humanistic psychology is always going to focus on human flourishing and well-being and reaching your full capacity. And it's just kind of this rosy division of psychology that's concerned with just health and well-being and not so concerned with the bad things that humans do. We're only really focusing on the good and how to become better, stronger people, essentially. So that's what positive psychology is all about. It's the study of human flourishing and figuring out how we strengthen people and help them to thrive. And then humanistic psychologists are the people who practiced positive psychology. There are also positive psychologists, and they use specifically scientific methods to study human flourishing. So humanistic psychologists are interested in human fulfillment, so are positive psychologists. But positive psychologists approach it from a basis of scientific methods. Okay, so next to subjective well-being, I want you to write down happiness. Subjective well-being is our measure of happiness. When you give someone a subjective well-being inventory, what you're effectively measuring is happiness. Subjective well-being is happiness. It's our measure of happiness. Subjective, the way that you feel, well-being, the way that you feel that you are, in terms of like your health or your satisfaction, right? So this is your self-perceived happiness, satisfaction, and we use it along with measures of objective well-being. So objective being things that we can measure more concretely, such as like your economic status, or something like that. And we use these two together to evaluate quality of life. Positive well-being. So there's like positive well-being and there's negative well-being. These are the results of the subjective well-being test. If you have a positive well-being, then you are pretty happy, right? You're satisfied with your past, you're happy about the present, you're optimistic about the future. And negative well-being would just be the opposite of that. You're not satisfied with your past, you're not happy in the present, and you're not optimistic about the future. Positive character, again, is promoting that flourishing within your character. So we're exploring and enhancing all sorts of qualities that lead to development of character. And then positive groups, communities, and cultures, we're looking to help groups, communities, and cultures flourish. At the end of the day, that's really all that, these are all very similar. Okay, so in this section, we're just talking about how long our emotional changes last, essentially, our emotional ups and downs. When you get really excited, how long does that last? When you get really depressed, how long does that last? And the answer to that really is not that long, usually about over the course of a day. You've experienced a lot of emotional ups and downs that are minor, but here's some more information from this section. So over the long run, our emotional ups and downs tend to balance out even over the course of a day. A stressful event can trigger a bad mood, but again, by the next day, that gloom has usually lifted. So it's kind of like as soon as you go to sleep and wake up in the morning, you've reset a little bit on your emotions, unless, of course, something traumatic has happened that's going to affect you on a daily basis for a while. But people tend to bounce back from a bad day with a better than usual mood the next day, so that's kind of interesting. And then worse events can drag us down for longer periods of time. Eventually that bad mood will usually end, though. And even severe trauma or tragedy isn't permanent. People who become blind or paralyzed may not completely recover how satisfied they used to feel, but if they have a pretty agreeable personality, they can usually recover just about normal levels of their day-to-day happiness, even with a huge trauma or tragedy having happened. And so the surprising reality, kind of the main take-home point here, is that we overestimate how long our emotions are going to last, and we underestimate how resilient we are and how much we're able to adapt and adjust to big life changes. So we think that we are going to be upset for longer than we really are, typically. Okay, so this section talks about, would you be happier if you made more money? And of course, most people are going to be like, of course, if I had more money, I would be way happier, right? But the reality is, money does buy happiness only up to a point. So if you look at people in really rich countries compared to people in really poor countries, of course, people in richer countries are happier than people in poorer countries because their basic needs are met. But that's kind of all that really matters. As long as you have enough money to not go hungry, to have a sense of control over your life, and to occasionally be able to treat yourself to something special, that will predict greater happiness. But then you kind of plateau off and you don't keep seeing an increase in happiness after that point. So when we raise a low income, this is going to increase happiness much more than if we raise an already high income. Once we have enough money, piling up more and more matters less and less. Experiencing luxury actually diminishes our pleasure in sort of simpler activities. So can, to some point, actually make you more ungrateful and more unhappy the more that you have. Economic growth in affluent countries has provided no apparent boost to people's morale or social well-being. Notice that says in affluent countries. So if you're in a third world country and we have some economic growth, we are going to see a boost in happiness because now all of a sudden our needs are being met when they weren't before. But in an affluent country, we already have it good, and so seeing economic growth usually doesn't result in that much of a change in terms of subjective well-being. And then thinking about money will actually cause people to pay less attention to other people and become less warm and caring towards others. So if instead you prioritize things like intimacy, personal growth, social bonding, community contribution, things like that, then you're going to experience a higher quality of life as a result of that. Okay. Adaptation level phenomenon is really just saying that we judge things in comparison to our past experience. So let's say that you were making $10 an hour and then you got a new job and it paid you $15 an hour. You're going to be like, wow, this is great. I'm making more than I was before. This is awesome. But if you had been making $20 and then you moved over to a new job where you're making $15, the amount is the same, I'm still making $15, but because I had been making $20 in the past, now my reaction isn't, oh, this is great. My reaction is, dang, I'm losing money now, right? So adaptation level phenomenon, next to that, I want you to write comparing to your old self. Comparison to your old self. Adaptation level phenomenon occurs when you compare yourself to your old self. And so feelings of satisfaction, dissatisfaction, success and failure, and judgments we make are based partly on the expectations that we form by our own recent experience. And then relative deprivation, next to this, I want you to write down comparing to others. So next to adaptation level phenomenon, comparing to old self, next to relative deprivation, comparing to others. Comparing to others. So with relative deprivation, you're comparing yourself to other people as a measure of how well you're doing, essentially. So satisfaction stems less from our income and more from our income rank. So how much we're making compared to other people. It's better to make $50,000 when all your friends and family make $25,000 than to make $100,000 if all of your friends and family are making $200,000. So relative to the people around us, to the people that we're close to, we feel deprived if we make less than they do, or if we have less or are doing something that feels less valuable, right? We feel relative to these very successful people deprived of something. Comparing ourselves to other people. Places that have really great wealth inequality have higher crime rates, obesity, anxiety, drug use, lower life expectancy, and tend to be less happy overall. This can be explained by social comparison theory, but that's more complex than anything you need to know for intro psych. And then comparing ourselves with those who are better off than us breeds envy. But if we're comparing ourselves downward with those worse off, then we feel better about ourselves. That boosts contentment and pride. Okay. So what sorts of things predict happiness? Well, happy people tend to have high self-esteem. They're optimistic. That's a big one. Optimism is really highly correlated with happiness. Outgoing, agreeable. Agreeableness is also very correlated with happiness. That's a personality trait. They tend to have close, positive, and lasting relationships. They tend to have work and leisure that engage their skills. They often have an active religious faith, and they sleep well and exercise often. Happiness does not seem to depend much on age, gender, or physical attractiveness, which is somewhat surprising. And 36% of differences in people's happiness ratings was heritable. So there's, to some degree, happiness has got to be genetic, right? And, that makes some sense too, that even though it appears to be genetic, it could also be confounded with environmental variables too. Like if your mom is very, very optimistic and therefore you grew up learning to be very, very optimistic by watching her, it's not just that you're happy because she's characteristically a happy person and you got happy genes, but because you're also living your life with optimism, which is an environmental effect that she sort of taught you, right? And then your personal history and your culture matter too. Happiness seems to fluctuate around some kind of set point. So everyone has kind of a base level of happiness, like when you wake up in the morning, just kind of your base mood level. And then, of course, you can feel more or less happy based on things that happen, but we always kind of hover around that set point. And then just some suggestions to be happier, set goals, act happy. So that's like that facial feedback and behavior feedback effect. If you're acting happy, you'll feel happier. If you seek work and leisure that engage your skills so that you have purpose, that boosts happiness. Buying shared experiences instead of material items. Exercising releases endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. If you've ever watched Legally Blonde, you might recognize that. Sleep is obviously important. Close relationships, like social bonding, is important for happiness. Focusing beyond yourself, counting your blessings, so being thankful, and taking care of yourself spiritually as well are all helpful for happiness. Okay. Moving into section 2, this is all about stress and illness, and then we'll end the chapter with like health and prosperity. So this is the more negative stuff first. Okay. So stress is composed of stressors and then the stress reactions. So you can think of the stressor as the cause. It's the cause of your stress. And the stress reaction is the way that you react to that thing that stressed you out. So this is stressor is the cause, stress reaction is the effect. You can think about it like that. There are 3 main types of stressors. The first is a catastrophe. So this is going to be an unpredictable large-scale event. Coronavirus is a great example, right? That's happened on such a large scale. It's affected almost every person on Earth in some way, or even just in this country, but it is a global issue. And then significant life changes. So this is still at the personal level, but it's a big deal. So this would be like leaving home, having a loved one die, taking on student debt, losing a job, getting divorced, just something that really changes a big part of your life. It's a significant life change. And then the last category is daily hassles and social stress. So this is another personal issue, but it's a minor one. So this, is an inconvenience, but it's not going to have a lasting impact on you, likely. And this is just like your cell phone dies, your roommates annoy you, you've got too much work to do, things like that, daily annoyances. And then you're going to want to know that cortisol is the most important stress hormone. So cortisol is what's released anytime your fight or flight response is activated. So anytime something stresses you out, cortisol gets released. And cortisol gets released into your hair as well. And so what's interesting is we've actually seen that we can take hair samples of children, and if we look and we see how much cortisol content is in their hair, you can actually tell if a child has been abused. and for how long they've been abused for, based on how much cortisol is in the hair and for what length of growth, essentially. You can trace that back to around what time the abuse started and stuff like that. So just know that adrenal glands release cortisol, which is that most important stress hormone, and then the adrenal glands also release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is responsible for that fight or flight response prepared by your sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so then general adaptation syndrome is just this idea of how we react or respond to stress, and it has 3 stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. So within the alarm stage, this is when you've just found out that something stressful has happened and you're reacting to it. So at this point, your sympathetic nervous system has activated, so your heart rate is increasing, you start to get stress hormones being released. And then during the resistance phase is when you're fighting that stressor. You're fighting against it, you're working to overcome the challenge in front of you. And so during this time, now your stress hormones are spreading throughout your body, throughout your bloodstream, right? And you're using your resources to overcome that challenge. And then your body's reserves start to dwindle, right? Start to like go down. As you were using them up, you start to run out, and then you run into exhaustion, right? Where this is the point where your immune system starts to tank. And so this is the point where you're most likely to get sick. I don't know if you've ever noticed that you've gotten sick right after something stressful happened. For me, I always get really sick right after finals. And so that alarm phase would be like, as soon as you finished classes and now you're like, oh man, finals are coming up. That's the next thing. And then your resistance phase would be the, dead days and whatever additional days you spend studying for those finals. And then as soon as you've taken that final, then you deplete to exhaustion. And this is the point where your immune system becomes weak and you become vulnerable to illness, potentially. Okay. And then the tend and befriend response is this idea that under a stressful event, people often want to bond with other people for support and help others, and then also receive help from others. So tend to help others, befriend to have the expectation that they will support and help you. This is more typical of a response for women compared to men. Men tend to kind of become more autonomous and want to deal with things on their own, whereas women want to seek social support to get through the stressful situation. How does stress make us more vulnerable to disease? Well, health psychology is a subfield of psych that provides contribution to behavioral medicine. And psychoneuroimmunology is the combination of psychological, neural, and endocrine processes. That's the immunology part of it. And how these things together are going to affect your immune system and your health. And this is just a branch of health psychology. Okay, and then we've got 4 types of cells that are involved in keeping your body healthy when you do have a stress response to something, or when something sort of invades your body and your immune system is required to respond to that situation. So first you've got B lymphocytes, and so these are responsible for releasing antibodies to fight bacterial infections. So on your worksheet, I want you to write down B equals bacteria, or B for bacteria. So B lymphocytes target bacterial issues, bacterial infections. They fight bacteria. And then for T lymphocytes, these are going to attack your cancer cells, viruses, and foreign substances. So I want you to write T equals terrorists and teratogans. Terrorists and teratogans. Remember that a teratogen is anything that can harm a developing fetus, and these are often things like viruses, foreign substances like drugs and alcohol, things like that. So T lymphocytes come in and they try to defend your body from receiving terrorist attacks from viruses or like unhealthy cells, and help you fight against teratogans from infecting and hurting your body. So B for bacteria, T for terrorists and teratogons. Have that written down. And then macrophage cells are going to come in and look around for harmful invaders and also your worn out cells. And so they're going to come along and eat all of these cells that could hurt you. But then your natural killer cells are going to attack diseased cells. So your natural killer cells kill your own cells, but only your own cells that have been infected with a foreign cell. So macrophage cells kill foreign cells. Natural killer cells come along and they eat up all of the original healthy cells that you had that were infected and became diseased. Okay. When your immune system doesn't function properly, you can have two different issues. Number one, it could overreact, and number two, it could underreact. So if your immune system overreacts, this could show itself as the immune system or as the body attacking its own tissues. And so this could cause an allergic reaction or a self-attacking disease. Multiple sclerosis is probably one of the most common self-attacking diseases. And women who tend to have stronger immune systems than men are more susceptible to those self-attacking diseases. So again, because our immune system is stronger, it can overreact and attack things that aren't actually sick. And then the other side of it would be underreacting, and now we aren't responding enough to something that is a present danger inside of the body. So this would be the immune system failing to stop a bacterial infection from spreading, so that flares, a virus erupts, your cancer cells multiply, things like that. And then sometimes when people get an organ transplant, the body can recognize that new organ as like a foreign invader, and so on occasion, surgeons will try to suppress the patient's immune system so that it doesn't try to attack the new organ that they've just tried to put in to help your body function. So sometimes we do suppress the immune system intentionally, but when that's the case, you have to be really, really careful that you don't catch anything, even something, that seems small, like a cold or flu, because that's why people die every year from the cold and flu and from things like coronavirus, is because it attacks people who have low functioning immune systems, particularly like old people and young children. Stress is going to disrupt your immune system, right? So that you can focus on fighting the threat right away. And then human immune systems react similarly. I think that this is pretty interesting. Surgical wounds heal more slowly in people who are stressed. That's been a reliable finding. Stressed people are more vulnerable to colds, and stress can speed up the course of diseases. So the link between stress and immune functioning is very strong. The more stressed that you are, the lower functioning immune system you're going to have. So it's an inverse relationship. More stress, less immune system health. Less stress, more immune system health. Okay. And then for this question about like stress and cancer, I really just want to see one thing written down on your worksheet for sure. And so I want you to write this down basically verbatim. Stress does not cause cancer. Stress does not cause cancer. However, if you already have cancer cells present in your body, stress can make their division multiply faster. So stress can cause cancer cells to multiply more rapidly, or it can cause cancer to progress more rapidly if someone already has it. But stress does not cause cancer. However, it can cause cancer to progress more rapidly if it's already present in someone's body. So make sure that something like that is written down on your worksheet, something that communicates that point. So then coronary heart disease is a clogging of the vessels that nourish your heart muscle, and this is the leading cause of death in most developed countries. It's the leading cause of death in the US, and things like high blood pressure, smoking, obesity, an unhealthy diet, and physical inactivity can contribute to causing it. The more psychological trauma that people experience, the more their bodies are prone to inflammation, which is associated with heart problems and other health problems like depression. And then, like I said, cortisol can be measured in your hair. So if you pluck a hair and measure its level of cortisol, I guess I covered this earlier, but nonetheless, it'll indicate whether a child experienced prolonged stress or abuse. And it can also predict whether or not an adult will have a heart attack in the future. So that's kind of cool. Okay. So type A versus type B people. Essentially, type A people are a little bit anal, right? Like they're control freaks, they're competitive, they're hard driving, they're impatient, they're aggressive, they're often anger prone. So A for like aggression, anger, stuff like that. And then people who are type B are like super easygoing, relaxed, like nothing is going to bother them. And so there were a lot of interesting findings from one study. 69% of those studied who suffered heart attacks were type A. Not a single type B person in the study had suffered a heart attack. And the main correlate between type A people and heart attacks was negative emotions. Write down that the highest correlated emotion to heart attacks or heart disease is anger. Anger is the most physically debilitating, damaging emotion that you can have. It's probably the most negative emotion that we can feel. And then hostility is going to correlate with other risk factors like smoking, drinking, and obesity. And so, of course, you can compound your risk for a heart attack by engaging in these things as well. Pessimists are more than twice as likely as optimists to develop heart disease. And then happy and consistently satisfied people tend to outlive unhappy people. And then as it pertains to stress and inflammation, heart disease and depression can result when chronic stress triggers blood vessel inflammation. And then people who experience social threats, including children raised in harsh families, are more prone to immune system inflammation responses. Inflammation does fight infections, but if you have persistent inflammation, that can produce long-term problems like asthma and clogged arteries. Okay, last section. So coping is really just the way that you deal with something that has stressed you out, with something that has bothered you. It's the way that you release that stress from yourself. And so there's problem-focused coping and there's emotion-focused coping. So if you are a person who's engaging in problem-focused coping, you're going to try to alleviate the stress directly by going to the source of the problem. So let's say that you did poorly on an exam. So that's your issue. That's what's causing you stress, the fact that you just did really poorly on an exam. You failed it. Well, if you're a problem-focused coper, what you're going to do is you're going to go into your professor's office hours, you're going to look over that exam, and you're going to do your best to attack the issue head on and make sure that you can guarantee yourself to do better in the future, right? So you try to deal with that stress directly by solving the root of the problem. Whereas emotion-focused coping is essentially saying, well, I don't think I really have any control over the situation, so I'm just going to try to make myself feel better about it. So instead of having the reaction of going into your professor's office hours and trying to work hard to do better on the next test, someone who is engaging in emotion-focused coping would likely do something like go home and drink. They would get drunk to feel better about having failed that test. And so the situations in which we use these type of coping mechanisms is essentially if we feel that we have control over a situation, if we think that there's something that we can do to change it, then we'll engage in problem-focused coping. But if we feel like our efforts are going to be in vain and no matter what we do, it's not going to change anything, then we're going to go with emotion-focused coping and just try to focus on making ourselves feel better instead of trying to solve the problem. Your personal control is exactly that sense of how much control you have over any given situation or over your environment as a whole. And then learned helplessness, so essentially is like one end of the spectrum. So if you have very low personal control, it's going to lead to learned helplessness. If you have very high personal control, then you're never going to see a result of learned helplessness. So learned helplessness is when you do not have personal control. And it's shown to you over and over that you do not have personal control, so you just have to accept that that's sort of how it is. The most common experiment that sort of brought up the idea of learned helplessness had to do with the shocking of the dogs. And you'll likely see a test question that relates to this study. But essentially, if you were to put a dog in some kind of chamber and offer it no way out and no way to escape shocks that you were going to give it. You give the dog shocks and it will jump around, it'll look for a way out, it'll try to essentially engage in problem-focused coping, where it tries to figure out, how do I get away from this thing that's hurting me. But if you continue to shock the dog and there's no way for it to avoid the shocks, then the dog will end up in a state of learned helplessness. And what that looks like is the dog will just lay down on the floor and resign to the fact that it's being shocked and there's nothing that it can do to stop it. And so it just lays there gloomy and accepts its reality, that it just has to be shocked. It's very sad. But this happens to people too, but usually not like in terms of abuse. I mean, it can absolutely happen in terms of abuse like that. But in general, when we're talking about learned helplessness with people, this is just like any time that you don't have control over something, and so your reaction to that is just, oh, well, it's helpless. I better just focus on dealing with my emotions about it instead of trying to solve the problem, because I can't solve the problem. I've learned to be helpless. I'm not even going to try to solve the problem because it won't work, right? Okay, and then we've got this internal locus of control versus external locus of control, and this is, again, just where your control lies, or where the control over your situation lies, I should say. So if you have, again, let's take this example of failing an exam. If you have an external locus of control, then you believe that it was external factors that contributed to that event happening. It's not anything that you did. So outside forces beyond your control determined your fate. So I failed that test because my professor is so difficult and mean and they want me to fail, and because this textbook is so dense and how could anyone possibly read the whole thing, and right, so this is just giving reasons for what happened that are outside of your control. I didn't cause this outcome of failing a test. It was all of these things outside of me that caused this. And so if you have an external locus of control, that's going to make you be a person who engages in emotion-focused coping. Whereas an internal locus of control is sort of taking responsibility for being in control of your own fate. So this is, it's a bummer that I failed this test, but I know that I can do better. I just have to try harder. I need to read the textbook. I need to study more. I need to practice Quizlet, right? Something like that. And so if you have an internal locus of control, that's going to lead you to engage in problem-focused coping. So make sure that next to external locus of control, you write emotion-focused coping. If you have an external locus of control, it leads you to engage in emotion-focused coping. And next to internal locus of control, write down problem-focused coping. Problem-focused coping. If I have an internal locus of control, I will engage in problem-focused coping. And then people who have an internal locus of control tend to be higher achieving because they take responsibility for their actions. They're in better health and they're typically less depressed than people who do not have an internal locus of control. Self-control refers to how well we can control our impulses and delay short-term gratification to get greater long-term rewards. That's just called delay of gratification. That's kind of our main measure of self-control, is delay of gratification. High levels of self-control predict good health, higher income, better school performance. Strengthening self-control is an important key to coping effectively with stress. Oh, I guess that's the end of that slide. Okay, moving on to this section on explanatory style, optimism and pessimism. So optimists are going to respond to stress with smaller increases in blood pressure, and they recover more quickly from surgeries often. Optimists get better grades, and we resolve relationship conflict more successfully. There were 3 studies on optimism. One followed a bunch of nurses that saw that those who scored in the top quarter for optimism were 30% less likely to die than those scoring in the bottom quarter. 180 Catholic nuns wrote brief autobiographies, and those who expressed happiness, love, and positive feelings in those autobiographies lived 7 years longer than those who didn't. And optimists not only live long lives, but they also maintain a positive view as they approach the end of their lives. So 68,000 American women found that So this study just found that optimism led to greater life satisfaction at the end of your life. Optimism runs in families. One genetic marker of optimism is a gene that enhances oxytocin. Write oxytocin in big letters in this section. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is so important, and next to it you want to write social bonding hormone. This brings you closer to other people. Oxytocin is what's released when you cuddle with people. Oxytocin is related directly to intimacy. So make sure that you write oxytocin and intimacy real close to each other. Oxytocin is the hormone that's released when you experience any kind of intimacy. Oxytocin and intimacy, very closely related. It enhances social bonding. It encourages us to want to form social relationships. So oxytocin is, of course, adaptive in that sense. But the good news is that pessimists can learn how to become more optimistic. So you're not, if you are pessimistic, don't be even more pessimistic that you can't possibly become unpessimistic, right? You can learn to become more optimistic. It just kind of takes hard work and recognizing your thought processes before they get too toxic, essentially rerouting them. As it pertains to social support, compared with those who have a bunch of social support, those who are socially isolated or lonely had a 30% greater death rate. The association with risk of death from social isolation is equivalent to the association with smoking. So social isolation is essentially just as risky for death as smoking can be. And we need not only just to have contact with people, but we have to form those close, intimate, and loving relationships. Social support calms us, reduces our blood pressure and stress hormones, so it activates your parasympathetic nervous system and inhibits your sympathetic nervous system, fosters stronger immune functioning, and gives us an opportunity to confide painful feelings in other people. When it comes to exercise definitely improves health and also decreases depression. We'll talk more about the effect of exercise on depression when we get to chapter 15 on psych disorders. But just know that exercise has a huge impact on stress and well-being. So if you exercise at least moderately, that adds to your quantity of life, how long you'll live, as well as your quality of life, how satisfied or happy you are. Exercise strengthens your heart as well and other important things for your body and predicts a lower risk of cancer. Like I said, it's a bit of an antidepressant. It can diminish depression as effectively as antidepressants and with longer lasting effects. Now, that's not to say that exercise is a cure-all for anyone who has depression. Certainly, there are individual circumstances. But nonetheless, instead of jumping immediately to medications, you should certainly try to do everything in your power to not have to be medicated first, right? So we often tell people who are depressed, well, you should try things like exercise first to see how that might affect you and see if we can actually do without antidepressant drugs and still give you a quality of life that's satisfying for you. Exercise will also stimulate neurogenesis, the production of new neurons that are more stress resistant. So that's kind of cool. You won't have to worry too much about biofeedback. That's kind of a really complicated process. So we'll just skip right over that because that'll take a lot of time to explain and it's not important enough to explain. So relaxation procedures are going to help alleviate headaches, hypertension, anxiety, and insomnia. Relaxation techniques help people to heal faster after having surgery. So if we actually encourage people to practice relaxation and meditation, that helps them to heal faster after they've had a surgery. And in particular, mindfulness meditation is a reflective practice where you're supposed to think about your current experiences in a non-judgmental and accepting manner. It's supposed to bring you closer to just accepting the reality that you live in and not being stressed by the circumstances you find yourself in. Mindfulness is going to lessen anxiety and depression and improve your sleep, interpersonal relationships, and your immune system functioning. It strengthens connections in regions of our brain. It activates certain regions associated with reflective awareness. like it reduces activation in the amygdala and increases activation in the prefrontal cortex. Things like this. It calms your brain when you have an emotional challenge in front of you. Last one. Okay, the faith factor. So the faith factor is this correlation that we've discovered that religiously active people do tend consistently, reliably, to live longer than those who are not religiously active. And so the question is, well, what is it about religion or religious engagement that's causing people to live longer? Is it that, literally if I just decide to be religious today, that's going to add another 10 years to my life? Probably not, right? So what could be this link? Why is it that faith, having faith or engaging in religious activity tends to predict longevity of life? And so some explanations that we have are healthy behaviors. So religion promotes self-control and therefore is going to encourage you to engage in more healthy behaviors. And if you're engaging in healthy behaviors, such as not really using drugs and alcohol, then that can lead you to live longer. The second one is social support. So because faith is often a communal experience, if you belong to a religious community, you tend to have the support network of those people around you. Social support can be really predictive of long health. Remember that if you're in isolation, that is just as risky as smoking when it comes to death rates. And then lastly, positive emotions, so kind of optimism. If you're religiously engaged, you may benefit from a stable, coherent worldview, a sense of hope for the long-term future, feelings of ultimate acceptance, and the relaxed meditation of prayer could also kind of be a confounding variable in there. That prayer is essentially meditation, and we know that meditation lowers stress and increases a lifespan. So those are kind of some options there. But in any case, what we did find is that the correlation between faith and longevity is not due to factors like age or economic difference. And the life expectancy for people who are religiously engaged is 83 years compared to 75 years for those who are not religiously engaged. So just know, too, that the term faith factor refers to that correlation between faith and health, the fact that religiously engaged people live longer. That's what the faith factor is. It's that correlation that exists. But the faith factor doesn't tell you why the correlation exists. The faith factor just says, hey, I am this correlation. Right? Okay. That's it. That's all. So make sure that you turn this in and take the Canvas quiz by midnight tonight if you want to receive your test review emails and materials by tomorrow. Okay? All right. Have a good one.